I want to welcome you to this online workshop for interim moderators. My name is Tim Purvis, and I work at the National Church Office of the Presbyterian Church in Canada as Associate Secretary, Ministry and Church Vocations. I will be presenting this workshop along with my colleague, John Peter Smith, who is the Regional Minister for Congregational Health for the Synod of Central, Northeastern Ontario, and Bermuda. This presentation will be in two parts, with each part dealing with one of two different interim moderator situations. The first is the normal and expected situation, a pulpit vacancy where the interim moderator serves a congregation which will be engaged in a search process where it anticipates calling a new minister. And this is typically a time-limited commitment on the interim moderator's part of around a year, so the interim designation is accurate. It follows well-established processes. We know what we're going to do when we're an interim moderator in this situation. We know what the interim moderator's roles and duties and responsibilities are. But the second situation is one we're seeing more of in our denomination, and that is the unexpected situation. Here, the interim moderator is serving in a congregation which will not be engaging in a search process to call a new minister. And this can be for various reasons, but usually because the congregation is small and without the financial resources to call a minister. In these situations, the interim designation really isn't accurate, since the interim moderator's responsibilities are open-ended, without a clear ending. And I know of situations where ministers have been serving as interim moderators for many years in the same congregation. And here there are no established processes, and the interim moderator's role and duties and responsibilities are not really clear. So I want to talk first about the expected interim moderator situation before throwing it over to John Peter, who will talk about the unexpected situations. A lot of this is straight up Book of Forms 213. When a pulpit's declared vacant, the presbytery appoints an interim moderator to the normal situation involving the process of moving to fill the pulpit vacancy. In terms of how the interim moderator is chosen, 213.1 is about presbytery making sure that the interim moderator is a good fit. Now, the session may have someone in mind who they'd prefer to be the interim moderator, and they could ask the presbytery if the presbytery would consider appointing that individual. The presbytery should consider the session's request, though it might not be possible for that person to serve. Maybe they've already been an interim moderator recently, or they're already serving as an interim moderator elsewhere. There could be a number of reasons. There are some ethical issues as well regarding the presbytery's choice of an interim moderator. It's not a good idea, for example, to appoint someone as an interim moderator who may be in a conflict of interest situation, like a retired former minister of the congregation, or somebody who may have family members or relatives in the congregation. And a minister who may be interested in the pulpit vacancy should graciously decline to serve as the interim moderator. Now, if you're a new interim moderator, if you've never done this before, don't be afraid to reach out to a more experienced colleague for guidance. Every interim moderator had to do it for the first time. Every interim moderator was once where you are. And we're a collegial body. We learn in community. An interim moderator's basic responsibilities fall into two parts. The first is to oversee the overall life and work of the congregation. And the second is to work with the search committee as it seeks a new minister. Now, where feasible, some presbyteries have appointed co-interim moderators, one person to work with the search committee in finding a new minister, and another to work with the session to oversee the ongoing life and work of the congregation. Sometimes this happens in particularly large congregations with large sessions. The one co-interim moderator works with that session. The other co-interim moderator will work with the search committee. A pulpit vacancy is often an anxious time for a congregation. There's a lot of uncertainty and anxiety is high. And there is a temptation sometimes for a congregation to want to rush through the process. Let's get a new minister as soon as we can. But there are some good reasons for resisting that temptation. The first is the congregation will need some time to grieve and to let go of the former minister. Particularly if the minister was well loved and served there for some time, the congregation is going to need some time to work through their feelings and to say goodbye. The second is the congregation is going to need some time to go through the search process properly. And that's something that cannot really be rushed. So what are your first steps as an interim moderator? First, meet with the session without the minister. Do some introductions, explain the process, the search process, let them know what they can expect, answer any questions that they may have. As I indicated, anxiety will be high, and this will go some ways to alleviating that. It might also be a good idea to meet with the outgoing minister, share some thoughts and some concerns and some perspectives. Find out as well what the outgoing minister's plans are going to be, and perhaps have a conversation about how the outgoing minister's relationship with the soon-to-be former congregation will change. You may need to discuss boundaries. The idea that the minister is going to need to be removed from the congregation for a while as the former minister. That the minister, as former minister, should gracefully decline invitations to conduct baptisms and weddings and funerals and pastoral services. It really isn't healthy for a former minister to maintain professional and pastoral ties with the former congregation. It prevents the congregation from letting go and moving on and coming to a place where it can transfer its pastoral allegiances to a new minister. If your presbytery in its standing orders conducts exit interviews, and I would hope that it does, make sure that it happens. And Ministry and Church Vocations has resources to help with the exit interview process. If needed, just contact me and I can help you with that. The interim moderator also must formally declare the pulpit vacant by ensuring that the presbytery's edict to this effect is read. And this is something that could be done when the interim moderator takes the first service after the former minister leaves. Once you've started as the interim moderator, perhaps a month or so into the job, there are some issues that you need to concern yourself with. For example, does the congregation have the human and financial resources to sustain its ministry and a new minister for at least 5 years? Is the congregation viable? Are there conflict or unresolved issues, power issues perhaps? Are the session and the board of managers frequently squabbling over who has say over what happens in the congregation? Are there strong differences of opinion about the outgoing minister? Some very supportive, some very critical. Did the introduction of some new program or some ministry initiative create tension in the congregation? And I think many would be familiar with the worship wars, where conversations were had about having contemporary music and worship along with traditional music. Now, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Does the departing minister understand the need to make clear to the congregation that they will not be around anymore, that they are the former minister and will not be available for pastoral services after they're gone? Is an intentional interim minister required? Does the congregation, for example, have a history of short-term pastorates that ended unhappily? Did the previous minister leave under a cloud? Did the presbytery have to intervene and dissolve the pastoral tie for some reason, perhaps because of a high level of conflict between the minister and the congregation, or because the minister was removed because of ministerial misconduct? Are the congregation's issues serious enough to warrant a short-term specialist working with them to resolve and help to resolve their issues? Also, how well does the session function? Do the members of the session work well together? Is it a functional, collaborative decision-making body? Or is it a rubber stamp for the minister? Do they need some remedial training on what a session's role and function is? What about the membership role of the congregation? Does it need to be revised? Are there names on that roll that should have been removed a long time ago? What else needs to be done before the new minister can come? Are there staff who are not working well or at all, and who should be encouraged perhaps to gracefully step down? Are there lay leaders whose time has come and who might consider retiring during the vacancy? Are there groups or committees that have outlived their usefulness and could be disbanded? Is there a manse? And if so, what state is it in? What's it like? Does it need major repairs? Is there an expectation that the minister will live in the manse? Or will the manse be rented and the minister be receiving a housing allowance? Are there other things with respect to the congregation's processes and procedures that may need attention? For example, counting the offering before it leaves the church. Some congregations have fallen into the habit of not doing that. Perhaps there is only one signature on all of the checks when the law of the church requires 2 signatures on the checks. That's something that may need to be looked at and changed. And this could be one of the interim moderator's most useful functions, to deal with these things so that the next minister doesn't have to, and the next minister will thank you for it. Other things to consider as you're going along. You're going to need to determine your level of accessibility to the congregation and the congregation's level of accessibility to you. And you're going to need to remind the congregation that you still have your own church to pastor, and you are not going to be available at all times or for everything. You're going to need to work on pulpit supply, compiling and contacting pulpit supply preachers. Now, this is a challenge, more of a challenge these days with so many pulpit vacancies, but the pool of pulpit supply clergy typically is retired ministers or active ministers who are in non-congregational positions. They don't have Sunday responsibilities, or they could be ministry students at theological colleges. Although if the student is in a graduating year and is interested in the vacancy, they should decline pulpit supply there. You will also want to connect with the Board of Managers or the Finance Committee to discuss a number of things. The budget for the vacancy, the honorarium for pulpit supply and travel, the interim moderators honorarium and travel, search committee expenses, travel and accommodation and meals for candidates coming for in-person interviews or preaching for the call. This generally is around $15,000 to $20,000. It may vary. You want to visit the manse, if there is one, and the church property. Take a look at the minister's office space. What's available? Is there a desk? Are there bookshelves? You will also want to begin a conversation about the stipend and allowances that are going to be provided to the next minister. What was the former minister paid? What's typical of stipends for other similar-sized congregations in that area? And the conversation rather, will eventually result in developing the terms of the call. I want to talk for a moment about the difference between the terms of the call and an employment contract. Now, an employment contract is a legal thing. It is a legally binding contractual arrangement between an employer and an employee. So you sign on the dotted line and the terms are there. But in our understanding of ministry, our theology of ministry, the terms of the call are much, much more than a simple employment contract, an employer-employee relationship. The terms of the call establish a covenant relationship between a minister and a congregation, where they promise before God to work together for the mutual good and the mission of that congregation as a witness to Christ in the community. And flowing from that, we make a distinction in our understanding of ministry between a stipend and a salary. A salary is an amount that is paid for time worked. It's paid after the work is done and after the service is done. So typically at the end of the month, perhaps. It is a fee for service. But a stipend is something different. A stipend is an amount that is paid to free up the minister from the need to do other paid work. And so it is paid before the work is done at the beginning of the month, typically. The minister in this case is freed for service. The time will come when the session is going to have to select a search committee, and there are always some challenges here. You would want to choose people who have the spiritual maturity and the wisdom to enter into this discernment process. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be longtime members or the matriarchs or the patriarchs of the congregation or the big donors or the token youth representative. That's not mutually exclusive. They could be one of those, but those should not be the primary criteria. Committees sometimes feel that they have to have representatives from every group and organization in the congregation. And that makes committees large and cumbersome. So it's better to have a small committee, perhaps with 5 to 7 members, with an openness, members who have openness to new possibilities for leadership. And this is different from, let's say, we want a minister who is exactly like our last minister. The members of the search committee would be open to recognizing that where the congregation is in their spiritual journey together may need a different set of ministerial skills and abilities from the previous pastor. Gil Rendell of the Alban Institute offers a suggested alternative method for choosing search committee members. He says, have the session sit down and brainstorm 2 lists. On the first list, they put down what they want in a search committee member. In the second list, they put down what they don't want in a search committee member. Then present both lists to the congregation and have people nominate candidates who are closest to the criteria on the first list and furthest from the criteria on the second list. And people can nominate themselves. The session then chooses from these candidates who is going to sit on the search committee, and the session can do this by simple appropriate vote. And then the search committee should be commissioned in a service of worship so that the congregation sees who they are, and prayers and God's blessing are asked upon them. Typically, the interim moderator convenes the search committee meetings. And those who are going to search or serve on a search committee need to understand that this is a significant commitment in time. Now, in the age of Zoom and video conferencing, a lot of meetings that used to take place face-to-face can perhaps take place more quickly and efficiently that way, but it is still going to involve a significant time commitment on the part of those who are going to serve on the search committee. One of the first tasks the search committee will be involved in is preparing a congregational profile. Now, what is a congregational profile? A congregational profile is a written document that is presented to candidates, prospective candidates for the pulpit vacancy, which describes everything that they need to know about the congregation to discern whether or not God is calling them to this particular place at this particular time. So the congregational profile presents a portrait of the community in which the congregation is situated. What's the place like? Is it a city? Is it a small town? What is the local culture like? The congregational profile also provides an accurate picture of the congregation's history, its life and its mission and its vision. And importantly, its human and financial resources. What staff does the congregation have? What kind of shape are the congregation's finances in? The congregational profile will also offer a description of the kinds of ministry gifts and strengths and skills that the congregation seeks in its next minister. And as I indicated earlier, it may be a different set of skills that the former minister had. The former minister presumably took the congregation as far as they could to that particular point in its life. And now the congregation may need someone with a different skill set. This is all part of the discernment process. And once those skills have been identified, they are included in the congregational profile. So how does the search committee go about preparing the congregational profile? The first thing that it needs to do is get accurate data and information about the congregation. And there are different ways to do this. The search committee could use the congregational self-analysis tool provided by the Presbyterian Church in Canada. It has some limitations. It's not perfect. But it does help to do that sort of needs assessment and present some sort of understanding of the congregation's needs at that particular point. The search committee could use another congregational self-assessment tool if they know of one. For example, some use the SWOT analysis, SWOT, where they do an analysis of the congregation's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. There are a number of congregational analysis tools. Demographic information about the congregation is important. And here you can refer to the statistical annual reports that go to General Assembly, which track attendance, membership, finances over many, many years. You could, for demographic information about the community and the surrounding community, there is always the Statistics Canada census data. If you want to present something of the history of the congregation, you can go to old annual reports or congregational directories. Those photo directories that many congregations have also often have brief histories in them. Your congregation may have a congregational historian whose hobby it is to keep track of all of these things over the years. In terms of the community's history, you can get that information from tourism websites or from the municipal website. The congregational profile form that Ministry and Church Vocations provides has a list of 18 ranked priorities. And part of the problem with that is there seems to be some tacit assumption in some quarters that every minister is somehow good at all 18 of these particular skills. That's not the intention. Some ministers are very strong at some and less strong at others. And the idea with the forum is to rank them So ministers in their personal profile forms will rank their strengths, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way down to 18, and congregations will rank their needs. This is what we're looking for, the skills we're looking for in our new minister, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way down to 18. And it's always important to make the congregational profile look good and attractive and appealing. And sometimes we get requests at Ministry and Church Vocations for samples of recent congregational profiles, which offer some suggestions as to what a good profile can look like. Now, a word about the remits. We often get questions both from candidates who are seeking calls and from congregations that are looking for a new minister. What do we say about ourselves with respect to the remits? And the advice that we have given is be honest. State clearly in the profile somewhere where your congregation is. Does it have a traditional understanding of ministry and marriage? Does it have an affirming understanding of ministry and marriage? Or is the congregation in discernment mode, where we don't know where we stand right now, we're figuring it out? Don't make anyone guess. And if your session has a policy, a marriage policy, mention that policy and state what it is, if there is one. Now, once you've got your profile, then and only then should you start advertising the congregation, putting it out there. And you can contact Ministry and Church Vocations as well to have the pulpit vacancy listed on the National Church website. And it is a very popular site. It gets visited all the time. So who can be considered as a candidate for a pulpit vacancy? What kinds of candidates are interim moderators and search committees permitted to look at? And this, again, is straight Book of Forms, section 215. Candidates can be ordained ministers from the Presbyterian Church in Canada in good standing. They can be candidates that are certified for ordination. They're not yet ordained, but they are certified for ordination by their presbyteries. The candidates can be graduating students from our theological colleges who are certified for ordination by their presbyteries and who also have the permission of their college. They can be considered as candidates for a pulpit vacancy prior to their graduation. And also ministers from outside the Presbyterian Church in Canada, ministers from other denominations who are declared eligible by the General Assembly to be received as ministers in the Presbyterian Church in Canada. And this means ministers who have made an application to the Committee on Education and Reception, and their application has been successful and they've been declared eligible to be received as ministers in the denomination. This is important because interim moderators and search committees will occasionally get applications from ministers from outside our denomination and even from outside the country. A minister, for example, from the Presbyterian Church USA, or a minister from the United Church of Canada. They cannot be considered as eligible candidates for a pulpit vacancy until they have gone through the education and reception process and been declared eligible for reception as ministers in our denomination. So if you get an application from someone like this, interim moderators are encouraged to let them know that they have to go through the E&R process first before they can be considered as candidates, and that their next step should be to contact me, because one of the hats that I wear is as the secretary of the Committee on Education and Reception. Have them contact me expressing interest in becoming a minister in in the Presbyterian Church in Canada and asking how to go about it. And we will take it from there. After the congregational profile has been prepared, after the pulpit vacancy has been advertised on the National Church website, and perhaps in other ways, profiles are going to start coming in from interested ministers who are interested in the pulpit vacancy. Now, one of the decisions that the search committee needs to make is whether to use the profile referral system that Ministry and Church Vocations has. If so, you will contact the Ministry and Church Vocations office. Marjorie Copeland is the person who looks after our profile referral system, and she will receive your requests in your congregational profile with your 18 points ministry skills filled in, and we'll run a search and we'll send you the profiles of ministers that match most closely for the search committee's consideration. Another thing to determine is whether or not the search committee is going to have a hard or a soft cutoff date for receiving profiles. Do you want the profiles? We're open to receiving profiles up until this date, and this is going to be our firm date, or is there some flexibility with how long? Communicate regularly with the congregation. Where you are in the process. Even if you don't have anything much to say to the congregation other than we're receiving profiles and we are considering them, keep the congregation as much as possible in the loop in terms of the process. But also stress the need for confidentiality. You don't want to be dropping names or anything. The people who are applying, please respect confidentiality. The other thing that you can do is you can invite suggestions. You can ask, who is out there who might be a good fit for our congregation at this particular time. Search committees, through the interim moderator, are free to approach ministers who are currently in congregations to sound them out. Perhaps they weren't thinking about a call at that point. Perhaps they were, but a discreet inquiry can be made just to find out if the minister might be interested in the pulpit vacancy. And the other thing you want to do is communicate with anyone, all of the applicants, anyone who submits a profile. Let them know that you've received the profile, and let them know approximately what the search committee's timeline is for making a decision about a candidate. Once the search committee starts receiving the personal profiles of ministers and considering them as candidates, there will be some that the search committee will look at and say, we have a very strong consensus feeling these are not the individuals that God is sending to us at this time. There will be another bunch that the search committee wants to take a closer look at. Those are the ones, the applications and the profiles that the committee will look at in more detail. They may decide that they want to check out these applicants a little closer, looking at, for example, their initial sermons or their services. And now that there is so many services that are done online, it can be a relatively easy thing to find a minister and hear them preach and lead worship in an online service. You may want to, for some of the more promising candidates, go and hear them in person. Make a discreet visit to their congregation or to a congregation that they may be preaching in on some other occasion. Perhaps they're doing an anniversary service or a special guest speaker somewhere else. Hear them more often if you need to. The initial contact with candidates that are looking promising should be made by the interim moderator and the search committee convener. They may want to take them out for coffee or take them out for lunch to have just an initial conversation to sound them out about whether they may be interested in the pulpit vacancy. You'll want to check out the web presence as well of any prospective candidate for the pulpit vacancy. What's on their, what used to be called Facebook and is now called Meta page? What does their social media presence look like? And eventually you're going to narrow the field, as it were, to a short list, perhaps of the top 3 candidates for the pulpit vacancy. Once the search committee has narrowed the field to the top 3 or the short list, that is when the interviews begin in earnest. An invitation should be extended to each candidate to come and meet with the entire search committee for an interview. Take them out for a meal if that's possible with the entire search committee. If it gets to that, an arrangement might be made for the search committee to go and hear them preach live in a neutral pulpit. This may not always be a possibility, but if the minister is, as I say, speaking as a guest speaker in another congregation, not their own, the search committee may want to be visitors on that Sunday morning to hear them. At this point, you may be wanting to check out their references, and also to, in accordance with the Book of Forms, the law of the church, to contact ministry and church vocations to learn if the prospective candidates have any disciplinary notations on their candidate files. Eventually, the search committee is going to narrow the field to a single candidate to present to session for approval and to recommend that the session invite them to come and preach for a call. And then that brings us to the whole call weekend and the call, and we'll speak more about that. As interim moderator throughout this whole process, you will be the conduit for the communication with the candidates. And so when a candidate sends in a profile, the interim moderator should contact the candidate and thank them for submitting their profile. Do that as quickly as possible. If the candidate if the profile has been turned down, the search committee decides they're not going to pursue that candidate, the interim moderator should contact the candidate as soon as possible to inform them of this. The interim moderator should also be communicating with the congregation as much as possible about the whole process. Let them know where things are, even as I mentioned earlier, if there's not a lot to report. Again, feeling free to ask around, to find out if there are other ministers, making discreet inquiries of ministers who may not be searching, but who might be a possible good fit for the pulpit vacancy. In dealing with the search committee throughout the whole assessment process as they're looking at profiles, being as honest as you can with the committee without influencing the committee's decision one way or another. And I think there have been times when those who have served as interim moderators have been watching the process as the committee may be looking at a candidate, and the interim moderator's personal judgment is this may not be the best person for this congregation. And they think to themselves, well, what do I say? In the situations when I've personally been in that situation, what I've done is trusted the process, and I have trusted that the congregation and the session has chosen the members of the search committee wisely, that these folks have some wisdom and some discernment. And in my experience, the search committee has discerned that those individuals are also not perhaps the best choice for the pulpit vacancy. The process works, and so trust that process. Also, as interim moderator, be open to candidates who just kind of come out of the blue. There may be some unexpected candidates. And under the wire candidates who apply. A couple of thoughts about the interview process and how to prepare for and conduct the interview. Determine the questions ahead of time and determine who on the search committee is going to be asking which questions and in what order they're going to be asked. The best questions are soft, open-ended questions that invite a fuller response than just a yes or a no. The candidates, they wouldn't be before you at this point if they weren't qualified. So do recognize that. The search committee may want to consider asking questions about asking for stories. Tell us about a time when you had your greatest challenge in ministry. Tell us about a time when you experienced your greatest joy in ministry. Those sorts of questions that invite a story, a narrative response. One interview may be sufficient. If the committee feels afterwards that it might need a follow-up interview, do a follow-up interview, but certainly no more than 2 or 3 interviews. At the conclusion of the interview, ask the candidates if they have any questions for the search committee. And the search committee may learn a lot, and the candidate may learn a lot by the question that's asked and by how the search committee responds. Also, try and stagger the interviews and stretch them out so that they're not, no more than 2 candidates are being interviewed on the same day. Pace yourself. With respect to the selection of that candidate, the final candidate, the search committee should be operating towards a consensus. There should be a unanimous feeling among everyone on the search committee that yes, there is just a strong sense that this is the person that God is calling to serve in our congregation at this time. Are you ready to make the decision? And one of the best signs of that is that strong feeling of consensus. If the committee is not ready to make that decision, what more does the committee need? Do you need another interview? Do you need more information about the candidate? That is part of the discernment process at this point. But in the end, you should be expecting that the decision be unanimous, and also the decision on the session should be unanimous too. The search committee will make a presentation to the session and state why the committee believes that this is the individual who should be invited to come and preach for the call. Financial matters need to be sorted out before the call is preached. What's the stipend going to be? What's the housing allowance going to be? What other allowances are there going to be? And in some cases, I know in some congregations that may be have more modest financial base, they may not be able to offer the greatest stipend in the world. But one option to consider is offering an additional week, perhaps, of vacation time, because there are some situations where time might be better than money in preparing the terms of the call. When the call week the call weekend is something that should be planned. Plan an entire weekend of when the minister is invited to come and preach for the call, when there's an opportunity for them to meet with the congregation, perhaps at a come and go tea or a coffee hour or something like that on the Saturday. When the minister, after the minister preaches for the call, the congregational meeting to moderate the call should be held immediately after the service of worship. And if the candidate is not chosen, although typically at this point, if the search committee has done its work and there's that very strong sense of unanimity, the congregation will tend to vote in favor of extending the call. But if that's not the case, the interim moderator should speak to the candidate if the individual is not chosen in person. When the day of the call, or preferably the weekend of the call, arrives, make sure that there's plenty of time for the candidate to meet the congregation. I suggested previously an event like a coffee hour or a come and go tea, something where the candidate will have an opportunity to meet the folks in the congregation. You may want to publish a brochure or do something ahead of time to alert the people in the congregation about what's happening on the call weekend. Pay attention to hospitality. Hospitality is a gift, and this is one area where the congregation has an opportunity to shine. The candidate should be put up in a hotel if they're coming from out of town. Make sure that the meals are provided. Make sure that there's someone there to pick them up and drop them off. Make sure that there'll be somebody sitting with the candidate during the congregational meeting. And also, the interim moderator needs to be in attendance at the end of the worship service to conduct the congregational meeting to moderate the call. I know when I have done this in the past, I have finished my own Sunday service and done the benediction and then jumped in the car and then raced across town as quickly as I could to get to the congregation where I was interim moderator in time so that I could lead the congregational meeting on whether or not they were going to call the candidate. And also, as an interim moderator, be available to debrief after for anyone in the congregation who may have questions. Now, much of what follows here with respect to the congregational meeting and the work of presbytery is pretty much straight Book of Forms process and procedure. The congregational meeting, like all meetings, are opened with prayer. The interim moderator will ask if the congregation is prepared to proceed with the call at this time. And it's a simple motion, and at this point, it's voted on by a show of hands. And if the congregation feels that they're ready to go, then the terms of the call are presented, including the stipend, the allowances, and so on. And the name of the minister is included in the terms of the call. And the congregation will consider that. There is a motion made that the congregation approve the terms of the call, so approve the financial package that's there with the stipend and allowances. And this is typically voted on by secret ballot. Only professing members in the congregation can vote. Adherents cannot vote at this point. And there's also no provision in our church law for proxy voting. So someone who cannot be there physically present that day to vote can't send a proxy in. If the vote is in favor, if the majority vote in favor, then the motion carries. There is another motion as well, and that is to appoint representatives from the congregation to speak in favor of the call, which has to go to presbytery for final approval, because in our system of church governance, the presbytery has to sustain the call. And typically, the representatives are those who sat on the search committee. Often it's the search committee convener and maybe one or two members of the search committee, and they will go to the presbytery meeting and speak to the call. And at that point, the meeting is adjourned. There is a very important step that needs to happen after the congregation has voted to extend the call, and that is that the terms of the call must be signed. So all of the members of the congregation are given an opportunity to sign the call, and here adherents who cannot vote are given an opportunity on a separate sheet of paper to sign in concurrence of the call. And what that means is an adherent says, I realize I'm not a member of the congregation, but if I were, I would have supported this call. One of the best ways to do this is to make sure that the elders have their call sheets with them at the conclusion of the meeting, and no one gets out of the building before they have an opportunity to sign the call. So that may mean, setting up stations, and if the congregation has elders districts, inviting people to find their elder and go over to their elder where their elder is standing and to sign the call before they leave. If there are members who could not be present and who could not vote, they are still given the opportunity to sign the call afterwards. The elders can take the call sheets around to each individual who wasn't present at the meeting and ask if they want to sign the call and give them an opportunity to do so. That's the preferable way it should be done. But elders can also contact members of their districts and ask if they would be in favor of the call and if they would give the elder permission to sign on their behalf. And that can be done as well. After the call is signed, as interim moderator, you should have this lovely document with the terms of the call on the front and a bunch of call signatures, signed call signatures. Take them and put them perhaps in a duotang or some sort of binder to keep it all together neatly in one place. Then it has to go to presbytery. So work with the presbytery clerk. Contact the presbytery clerk to make sure that a date will be set for the presbytery to meet, to consider the call. Perhaps it will be at the next regular meeting. Usually it will. If there's no regular meeting, whether the presbytery may want to call a special meeting to consider the call, those arrangements need to be made with the presbytery clerk. Make sure your presbytery's ministry committee has had an opportunity to look through the call and look at the terms to make sure that everything is in order. And if the minister is in another presbytery, serving a congregation in another presbytery, that presbytery too must sustain the call. So has to be sustained by both presbytery, the calling presbytery and the presbytery from whom the minister will be called. So be careful to coordinate meeting dates with the two presbyteries. So your presbytery meets first, and then the call has to be sustained by the other presbytery on the other end. And also just a reminder that a police check, a vulnerable sector police check, should also be part of the call. The minister needs to have cleared one of these vulnerable sector checks. So what is the presbytery's role and responsibility? What does the presbytery do? Well, when the presbytery meets at the appointed time, the signed and attested terms of the call are considered at the presbytery meeting. And the interim moderator will be called upon to narrate the steps. And what that means is the interim moderator will give basically a brief description of the search process that led to this particular point where the call is being presented to presbytery. There is a motion where the presbytery approves the actions of the interim moderator, and then representatives from the congregation are invited to speak to the call. And what they're doing is they're simply presenting to the presbytery the reasons why the congregation believes that this particular individual is the one that God is sending to them at this time to fill their pulpit vacancy. Once the presbytery has heard the congregational representatives speak, if they are satisfied with the reasons why the congregation wants to call the individual, if they are satisfied with the terms of the call, that the stipend and allowances meet or exceed the General Assembly minimums and perhaps the presbytery minimums if the presbytery has set them, and if the support for the call is strong, and this is very important, the call should be signed and attested by a clear majority of the congregation. And typically presbyteries will be looking at around a 90% signing. So 90% minimum of the membership of the congregation should have signed the call. And if it's less than 90%, someone in presbytery may ask for an explanation why the call was not supported more strongly. And sometimes an interim moderator will have to say, well, moderator, there were a certain number of members who were infirm and in long-term care facilities, and they were unable to sign the call. There were some members who were vacationing outside the country and were unable to sign the call. The interim moderator will have to give a brief explanation as to why they couldn't get over 90% of the signatures. But if the presbytery is satisfied with all of these things and the strength of the call, the presbytery will then sustain the call. And as mentioned earlier, if the minister who's being called is serving in another presbytery, then that presbytery must go through a similar process on their end, and it must sustain the call. So the interim moderator and the representatives from the search committee can anticipate visiting that presbytery to present the call and speak to the call. Now, if there's a great geographical distance between the calling presbytery and the presbytery the minister is serving in, there may be a couple of ways around that. One might be for the interim moderator and the congregational representatives to make their presentation by Zoom or teleconference. Another way might be for the interim moderator to ask for someone else in the presbytery from which the candidate is being called to speak to the call on the interim moderators and the congregation's behalf. But it's always best if the interim moderator and the congregational representatives can be there in person, if that can happen. If the presbytery sustains the call, then that call document, the terms of the call and all of the signatures of those who have attested it and signed it, that is placed in the minister's hands, and the minister has, in the law of the church, 7 days to consider whether or not to accept it. In practice, the minister usually accepts the call on the spot. Now, when the new minister arrives, the presbytery holds an induction service to officially install that minister as the congregation's new minister, and that is always a great and glorious celebration. Once the new minister has been inducted, there will be a motion that the interim moderator be relieved of their duties and responsibilities with the thanks of the court. And that too is a great and glorious moment, because the interim moderator, the interim part of the interim moderator's job is fulfilled, and the interim moderator is no longer an interim moderator. However, it would be a good idea for the interim moderator to at least be available to the new minister and throughout the first year to get them settled and to help them settle in. This is particularly the case if the new minister is a new graduate, a new ordinand, and this is their first pastoral charge, the first congregation. It's always a good thing for a new minister to have someone to be there to assist and mentor them throughout their first year. And that would be something that the former interim moderator might consider taking on, and it would be greatly appreciated. And the minister, once inducted, serves in the congregation, and they all live happily ever after. So that's our hope and prayer. I'm going to turn it over to John Peter now to talk about the unexpected interim moderator situation.